Hello friends, welcome to this video. This is actually me recording the start of this vlog, probably at least a week, if not 10 days or 2 weeks after the previous content that you're going to see in the rest of the video. So where I'm at the moment, it is currently Tuesday the 3rd of November. It's election day for all our brothers and sisters across the pond in the United States. And I just finished up my midterm exams, so they're kind of called our CAs, or continuous assessments. So we had on Wednesday of last week an anatomy exam, which was a spot exam, which means that it's based on identifying primarily different structures within the central nervous system for the purpose of this semester. So all different structures in the brain, all the structures in and around the brain, so the ventricles, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the brainstem, etc. All of the arteries, the blood vessels, the cranial nerves, all that sort of fun stuff. So identifying all those different structures, and then there'll be additional questions answering for more clinically relevant stuff. Maybe it might be something along the lines of identify this nerve, and then you say, oh, it's the facial nerve, and then they'll ask, okay, what would happen if this nerve was injured, if there was a stroke, or if there was a tumor or something like that. So then you have to demonstrate your knowledge of, not only just identifying where it is, but also what its role is in the body and what would happen if it happened to be damaged in some way. So that was last week's exam, and then yesterday's exam was the remainder of our subjects as it relates to neurology. So that includes physiology, pharmacology, pathology, and biochemistry. So they're the other 4 subjects primarily, and again all related to neurological physiology, neuropathology, etc. So essentially, just overall the goal of this semester is to understand how the central nervous system works, how the special senses work, how motor function works, how the brain is responsible for things like cognition and learning, even all that sort of stuff. And then understanding, okay, if you understand what it is all supposed to do, what's the biochemistry underlying that, what's the physiology underlying that makes it all work, and what happens when it goes wrong. So the pathological side of things, so what types of tumors are there, what is multiple sclerosis, different types of infections, all that sort of stuff. And then finally, obviously, the layers on top of that, you can kind of see how it's quite logical, because you learn your anatomy, so what is there, then you learn your physiology and your biochemistry, how does it work, what's actually there to make all this stuff work, and then what can go wrong, pathology, and then finally, what do you do when it goes wrong, which is pharmacology. So pharmacological drug interventions for different diseases of the central nervous system, or the nervous system in general, really, the peripheral nervous system as well. So that's been the primary purpose of this semester, and that's the exams that just went by. So they went quite well, to be honest. It's been the most I've probably felt. I've never felt as prepared for exams before, which is interesting because I'm quite busy at the moment with other things going on. But because of the lockdown and everything, and because of learning online, I actually feel like I've been advantaged more than I normally would be. So on a normal semester, let's say of college, that I would be, training a lot in the gym, commuting to and from the gym, training jiu-jitsu, commuting to and from jiu-jitsu, and even just being in class. Sometimes you're in class, and because it's you're in person, you have the opportunity to go back on it later. You can't pause, you can't change the speed, you can't rewind. You always have to go over your lectures again, rather than just watching them one time when you're live in person. However, when you're learning online, it gives me the freedom to be able to rewind, to pause at the bits that I'm struggling with, to make more notes, to do some Googling, etc. And all of that then brings me to a point where that first pass at any lecture actually gives me a lot more. So it's overall, the kind of online learning experience has made my study so much more efficient. And because I don't have as many other commitments as I normally would, I've definitely felt a lot more prepared, because from the beginning of this semester I was just more or less on top of the lectures every single week. So at the end of the week I would feel like I've completed all of the content, or most of the content, and as a result I feel like I know most of the information that I should know. So then when it comes to exam time, it's just a case of looking back over it all again. So it really hasn't been too bad. Of course, it's still been stressful. I've been spending 14, 16 hours a day at the desk over the last couple of weeks between work and and study. So I have put in the work, but it has just felt like the work has been a lot more fruitful than it normally would be, having just had that extra bit of time and that extra bit of freedom to learn in the way that I prefer learning. So I certainly can't complain. With that said, those exams are now over, facing into November, which is going to be quite a heavy month in terms of university. What's going to pop up over the next few weeks are lots and lots of assignments. So we have to have a literature review done. That's part of like our final year project. I'm only in second year, but you kind of work on different components of it over the subsequent years. And my project is on brain tumours, basically. It's on awake versus asleep tumor resection. So you may have seen videos about that where neurosurgeons do awake brain surgery. So if you're able to stimulate different parts of the brain, or you're able to assess a patient's speech response or motor response while a certain area of the brain is being touched or stimulated, or if it has been resected, then that gives you an idea of where exactly you're at in terms of this person's motor mapping of the brain, or cortical mapping if it's related to speech mapping. But that's basically what my project is based on. Don't need to go into the details of the specifics of that, but that's more or less the topic that I'm looking at. So I'll be doing a lot of reading on that and doing the literature review over the next 4 weeks. And then along with that, we have, I think, 3 other assignments due that week as well. And then the subsequent week we also have an OSCE. An OSCE is basically a practical exam where you demonstrate clinical skills, do history taking, examining the different organ systems, etc. And then also we have our final year or end of semester. What am I saying? Final year? End of year, I should be saying. End of year or end of semester examinations, which are on the same topics that I just mentioned as it relates to the midterms, but we'll have more content that we will have covered by that time, obviously. So we still have lectures and everything over the next few weeks. New content, and then we'll have those exams again, which will be longer, more questions, and as a result probably a bit more challenging, but such is life. And we'll also have another exam, which is another online exam, which is a multiple choice type exam for the clinical module. So like we've got the practical clinical skills, we've also got questions related to that. So yeah, the exams are still absolutely challenging. People think sometimes when they hear like, oh, multiple choice exam, that's going to make it really easy, but very often it actually makes it harder, because you end up in a position where you're like, oh god, I thought that was right, but now that you show me that answer, that seems more correct, and oh god, there's lots of positives and negatives and stuff. So for example, which answer is incorrect, and then when you're going through them, it'll be like, this cell turns this on, which turns this off, which turns this on, and you're kind of like, whoa, too many ups and downs in that. But yeah, look, so that's the examination process. So yeah, everything's going well. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm just taking a bit of a break. We just had a meeting on Microsoft Teams, which was our SGL, which is small group learning, where basically you meet up with your group virtually at the moment and you discuss a specific case. So they provide us with a case, then we break it down into different learning objectives, and then everyone goes away for a week, looks up the information as it relates to that learning objective, and then you present the information back the following week in multiple different ways. You could present it as a PowerPoint, you could just talk through it, you could do a poem, whatever you want to do. Some people have even done dances and songs, so there's plenty of options. So that's that done, and now I'm just taking a bit of a break because the exam was yesterday, so I feel like there's just a little bit of pressure taken off because that's done and I'm not studying as vigorously. We'll still be studying, of course. I spent the morning working on triage work this morning, then we had the meeting at 1 o'clock. It's now 1:45. Just made myself a coffee. I'm going to do like 30 minutes of reading, so reading not related to medicine or anything. This is actually a book that I just got, which is The Philosophy of Science, and I hate that, an historical, but there you go, an historical anthology a historical anthology, as I prefer. But yeah, this is actually a really, really good book, because basically what it does is it takes you through 2,500 years of scientific thinking and the evolution of that, the disagreements, the debates, the ongoing disagreements, and what different philosophers of science have had to share over time, which is interesting to look at how it evolved. And you know, there's lots of fantastic thinkers to learn from, and some people think that philosophy of science is just boring and useless, but I think that is not true, because you have to have a philosophy that underpins something for you to be able to, you know, strip back and agree on first principles of how you decipher between, you know, what is true, or how to make decisions, for example. So how do you decide between pseudoscience and science? You know, that's a question that everyone meets in their everyday lives, especially in the kind of health and fitness space, and that's something the philosophers of science have spent a great deal of time discussing. So anyway, that's that. I'll do 30 minutes of reading there, drink my coffee, and then I will just kind of get back to work. So the plan for the afternoon is to keep doing triage work for the next few hours, because I had to kind of put that slightly on the back burner last week because of the exams. So I'll just do a bit more now this week, especially early on in the week, and then maybe Wednesday, Thursday, Friday I'll do more study, and then Saturday, Sunday again a bit more triage work. So you know, that's how things tend to go. So yeah, enjoy the rest of this video. I'm not just about to record a podcast with a friend from Italy, Marco Sterpa, I believe, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But his podcast is the Science of Muscle podcast, I believe it's called. And I'm going to show you some clips from that, and I will of course link the podcast episode if it is up in time when I post this video. So before we got on the call, is that like I wouldn't like to be the person trying to make these decisions, and they're really difficult decisions to make, to say how much freedom people should have, because obviously as soon as you start to take freedoms and rights, you could say, away from people, some people are going to get quite frustrated about that, and the behaviour is not going to be homogenous in the population, in that young people are probably going to be less worried about it, and if you're in college and you're an 18-year-old student, you're probably going to go to house parties and not think too much of it, you know. So I think it was inevitable that once schools reopened and colleges started again, and as a result students congregated together for house parties, etc., that we would see more cases rising again. Whether or not we did that too quickly, I think, well, the proof is in the pudding, really. If we're saying that things are getting worse, clearly it wasn't the best way of doing things, but again, I don't really know what the best way of doing things is at this point. You know, I'm no public health expert. And I initially, when I was just doing, this is what, I'm not sure if this is relatable, but I want to kind of put this forward because I think it's an interesting idea, and it's related to the concept of procrastination. And I think when someone only has, let's say, one thing to do, like let's say you're doing a final year project for college, and you procrastinate on doing that. When you procrastinate on doing that, what do you actually replace it with? Very often it's video games or Netflix or something like that, you know? So I'm not free of procrastination, and I don't think anyone is, but the difference is that, like I just mentioned there as it relates to the to-do list, when I'm procrastinating, it's generally moving from one thing that is, you know, would be considered a productive task that I don't really feel like doing right now, to another thing that is still a productive task. And like that might sound like, oh, look at this guy, he's just doesn't do anything bad, but it still comes from the same place of me saying, oh, I don't feel like doing that assignment right now, but I do have some emails I can do, so that'll make me feel a bit better, and it's a bit easier to do, so I'm going to do that now, you know. Or even saying, you know, I don't feel like doing much this morning, oh, thank God I have this podcast with Marco, that's a bit easier to do, I'm going to enjoy that, you know. So I think if you can actually start to, and this is definitely going off on a tangent from your question, but if you can kind of build a life in which when you are procrastinating, it's still useful, then that's a great life to have. Like, if your form of procrastinating is reading a book for the purposes of education, or if your form of procrastinating is you going to the gym, again, that's excellent. What you don't want is for your procrastination to just be doing nothing, sitting around, watching YouTube videos that have no substance. You know, that's fine every now and then. But that's really, I think, been one of the biggest differences for me. And I think that that's not something that everyone can necessarily achieve, and because I'm basically working with Triage while also doing a fairly challenging degree. So as a result, I know I have a certain amount to do, so it's necessity that I have to get a certain amount done in the day, or else like you fall behind. You know, that's it. It's as simple as that. You know, your clients aren't happy because you haven't done your work, and your grades are shit because you haven't done your study. So there is a necessity component to it as well. So I don't think it's anything inherent to me that makes me special or anything. It's just types of a way of living that I've developed over time because of necessity and because of my choices. With your life in general, if you schedule every single minute of your day and all of it is filled with things that you don't enjoy doing, like, sure, it might be productive, but it's not going to last. It is as simple as that. And that is why I'll always have on my to-do list, like it's literally here next to me, you know, read the books that I'm currently reading, read one chapter of this book, and, you know, get your training done. So it's the things that I actually enjoy as well, rather than just the things that I don't enjoy. Because if you don't make time for those things, that's a great way to become an unhappy person. And that increases in importance the further you get away from the things that you enjoy. So I really enjoy my degree. I really enjoy my work. Of course there are elements I don't like, but that means that I have less of a need, to be honest, for the kind of free leisure time that some people feel they really need. But if you have a job that you hate from 9 to 5, there's no point scheduling in from 5 to 9 more things that you hate. You're already doing that, you know. So you do have to be kind of a little bit kind to yourself as well. Presenting for the BSc in public health, so public health students as well as political science students. So it's an interdisciplinary module on politics and public health effectively. So I'm presenting a case study on loneliness, and presenting a specific case on osteoporosis and hip fracture. So I might show you a bit of that. You can see it on the screen there. I was just putting some of the final touches on my presentation. But yeah, so a little bit of a different activity for the day. Obviously I don't regularly do that stuff, but fun nonetheless.
And now I would like to hand over to Gary, and after he finishes, if you have any question, we can address it. So welcome, Gary, and thank you very much for being here. I think you can upload your
I'm just going to try and do that now.
Here.
Okay. I think previously what I've been doing is just sharing my screen, if that works, if that's okay.
Oh yeah.
Are you able to see my screen?
Great. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ora, for having me. I enjoyed the lecture so far. But as you said, what I'm going to do is basically just focus on the spiral of loneliness here, with an emphasis on osteoporosis and hip fracture. Okay, so what I want people to get out of this case in particular is looking at things at multiple levels of analysis, which I know has been presented in this lecture already, and there will be some crossover points between what's been presented and what I will discuss here as well. So just thinking about those different levels of analysis is really important. So here she tripped on a hall rug and she fell on her right hip. She presented to the emergency department where she was diagnosed with a right hip fracture. Now there's a couple of different pieces of information in there. And again, if we were to think strictly from that biomedical perspective, I might say she fell on her right hip, okay, so she fell, she's elderly, it seems like an appropriate source of trauma to cause an injury like this, a right hip fracture, okay, so it wouldn't be uncommon for an elderly individual to fall and to break their hip like that. But what adds additional information here is the fact that she tripped and fell over the hall rug. Now you might think that's fairly irrelevant, it doesn't really tell me that much, like she just fell, okay, but it is important, because the fact that she tripped and fell on the hall rug causes us to ask a number of additional questions. Okay, one might be, why was the hall rug positioned in the way that it was? You know, has she sought previous home assessment from an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist, for example? So in an elderly individual who has been previously hospitalized, you'd expect that there be some sort of home assessment and that this individual's home environment would have been assessed. So for that to be there might cause me to question, has this individual been in contact with the healthcare system before? Further to that, it might also cause me to question, does she have social support, which is obviously the most relevant thing here. Because if you were to go to your grandmother's home and you saw that her mobility was reduced, she was really struggling to get around the home, and you saw that there was this big rug in the hall that was in her way, then something you might think is, oh, Granny, maybe we should move the rug. So what I would be thinking here is, maybe this lady actually doesn't have support, she doesn't have people who have pointed this out, and that might have been why she fell. So again, there's other layers to this rather than just thinking hip or falling equals hip fracture, you know. And then she's 4 stone overweight and has a sedentary lifestyle. Again, the strictly biomedical way of looking at this might be 4 stone overweight. We know that if you are overweight by 4 stone, it's likely to be a risk factor for multiple diseases. However, that's kind of like a shallow level of analysis, because the question you might want to ask is, was she previously 4 stone overweight the last time she was in the hospital? If she was previously 8 stone overweight, then we could actually see this as being a patient who was malnourished, as opposed to just being a patient who's overnourished, okay? Because if she's lost 4 stone over the course of, let's say, 6 to 12 months, then it could be the case that she wasn't able to cook for herself. She had nutrient deficiencies, and this could be putting her at risk. And that all ties in then with the social support elements, because she mightn't have anyone cooking her a meal. And this is the really key point that I'd like you to take away, if nothing else. From the German aging study, they basically showed that falls, the risk of falls, was associated with perceived social isolation and exclusion, not with the number of contacts. So this is really, really important, because if one was to just carry out a very crude assessment of loneliness, let's say someone comes into the emergency department and you ask them, how many people have you seen in the last week, or how many people have visited your home? That's actually not assessing perceived social isolation or exclusion, and it doesn't actually tell us about the risk of falls. And that may seem counterintuitive, but it's reflected here in a more recent study this year from 2020. This is basically running back and assessing the presence of falls in a US population from 2006, 2008 and 2010, and they basically assessed 3 different categories. The first category is those who had perceived social support and did not feel lonely, okay? So there's a perceived element and there's a did not feel element. They're really important. And they're the people who had the lowest risk of falls. And then, those who lacked social support or felt lonely, so that or there, it's one or the other, they had a higher risk of falls, significantly higher risk of falls. But the key point here is that those who lacked social support and felt lonely, so it's not just the social support, it's also the feeling of loneliness, they were the ones who had the highest level of social or of falls here. So that's really important to get, is that it's perception and it's how one feels in oneself as opposed to just the contact, okay? As for the difference between the 3 years, 2006, 2008 and 2010, I'm not sure. It could be because of the financial crisis in 2008, but I don't know, that's just speculation, alright? And the thing that complicates all of this even more is that all of these things are interrelated, okay? These are not unidirectional causal pathways. If you have a lower level of self-efficacy, you're less likely to be physically active. If you're less physically active, you're less likely to have a high level of self-efficacy. So if you were an active individual who, you know, anyone watching this lecture, if you run 5 kilometers regularly, let's say, and I ask you, you know, how confident would you feel that you could run 6 kilometers, you'd probably say, you know, yeah, that seems reasonable to me, I can do that. However, if you've only ever run 500 meters and I ask you if you could run 6 kilometers, you'd be like, oh no, I could never do that. God, no, that's not for me. So if you're more physically active, you're more likely to have that higher sense of self-efficacy because you've proved to yourself that I can do this, I can do this thing. So all these things go and connect with each other. And not only that, they don't only push you in the direction of falls, it also mediates the relationship back to loneliness again. Because if we stick with that example, if you have low levels of self-efficacy and that affects your physical activity, that then makes it more likely that you're going to be more lonely, because you might be less likely to go to Tesco's to do the shopping, to go down the town to go to bingo, because you don't have the capacity anymore. So all of these things are interrelated with each other, and that's really important. It also comes back to popular media, and this is something that I would kind of encourage everyone to consider, is the language that we actually use when we're talking about disease and how that actually might affect someone's pathway down the line. So you see these things in popular media a lot of the time, like, help, my bones have started to crumble, okay? And if you're walking around every day, can you imagine thinking that, oh my God, my bones are going to crumble out from under me, you know? The reality of something like osteoporosis is that these things exist on a spectrum, and when doctors use language like, oh, your bones are getting a bit crumbly, the intent is to kind of reduce down a complex topic to something really simple, but the danger there is that it leads to kind of fear in the individual. Because if you thought that your bones were going to crumble, would you want to go and walk downtown and walk up steps and do exercise? You probably wouldn't. You'd probably feel like that was a bad thing. However, the reality is that it's actually a good thing. And all of these things tie back into that element of social support, because if you have someone who's going to tell you, hey, you know what, I know you're worried about walking up the stairs, but I'll go with you, that's going to reduce fear by increasing self-efficacy.